Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Something Something podcast. My name is Eric Kasloff, and with me, as always, Larry Sands. How's it going, Larry?
Excellent. Everything is excellent, Eric. The rains have finally started to fall on the heat wave known as summer in Texas. So it's great.
Hmm.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
here in Jersey, it is 70 degrees and kind of cold. But,
Nice.
Larry, we have two cool things I want to mention. By the time this episode goes up, we will be at 191 episodes,
Wow.
which means we are closer and closer to 200. And in a few days, we start recording the Spooktober shows.
Yes, that's going to be super cool.
The
Super cool.
third annual Spooktober. It is
Yes.
usually, ghost hunters, haunted locations. I bring on my horror YouTuber friends to
Yes.
talk about favorite horror movies, Halloween memories. So
Yes. Absolutely. It's going to
this
be
is going to be
awesome.
great.
It's going to be a great spooky season.
Yes.
But actually, speaking of spooky season, Eric, really quick, where are we with our feature film, Hillsborough Road?
I was waiting to tell you this. I'm editing the cute ending.
Oh,
The cute
wow.
part. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Save
Yeah.
the best cute ending for the last. That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's where
So,
I'm at. When I got to it, when I edited I was like, oh my gosh, it's almost over.
right,
I
right.
I got this bittersweet thing to me, like, what do I do now when I'm done editing? I start the next project, but I can't
That's right.
because of the unions.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, strikes.
But
Thank
hey,
you.
there is a writer strike going on,
Yes.
and a writer is one of our guests. So, Larry, tell everybody about our guest.
Yes, actually, our guest for this episode is a writer. He wrote a book called The Stench of Politics, Polarization and Worldview on the Supreme Court, which everybody listening to this right now knows the Supreme Court is a hot button topic. And so I'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. He's a professor at Arizona State University, Dr. Joseph Russomanno. Hi, Joe. How are you?
Hi, guys. Thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming
Absolutely.
on.
Yes, thank you for coming on. And as mentioned, the Supreme Court right now is very hot button. And I think it is no matter what side of the aisle you're on. There's always some kind of hot button going on. Um, talk talk a little bit, well, a lot about your book and what it's about.
Okay. Again, thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity. I think maybe where I might start is to explain the title,
Yes.
since you shared with everyone what that title is, The Stench of Politics. This was inspired by Justice Sonia Sotomayor on the court. And during the oral arguments of the Dobbs abortion case, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, she wondered with regret whether the Supreme Court would survive, as she called it, the stench created in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts, as she put it. And in fact, we have seen that the public's opinion of the Supreme Court is plummeting, and it's been plummeting for a while. And the primary reason is exactly what Justice Sotomayor expressed concern over, and that is that the court more and more and more seems to be driven by politics and political ends and not the kind of justice that we used to think that the court was all about.
Right, right. And originally, because now in your book, how far, okay, So this is a creative podcast, right? We
Yeah.
obviously talk to authors and musicians and filmmakers, and I don't think we've ever had a real opportunity to dive into getting into the political side, because obviously we kind of,
We're apolitical on the show, really.
yeah.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
and this is really a great opportunity for not only Eric and I, but really the people that love our podcast to listen and really find out what the Supreme Court was really supposed to be about. Do
Mhm.
you go back in your book that far as to explain it?
Not a lot. I mean, there are some roots that extend to the origins and constitutional explanations, but it's overwhelmingly a contemporary look, particularly with a focus on not the most recently completed term, but the one prior to that.
And what has been, because you have, and I was just reading on the website where I believe your book is published, right? The publisher, which links will be in the description.
Yes.
But um originally, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the true expert on this, but the Supreme Court was there to be apolitical and really look at law the way, how does that work? To wait, where did it come from and how did it start? I think that's a good place to start in
Yeah.
order to understand where you're coming from, where it is now, I think, because there's a great divide, right?
Sure, absolutely, there is now, and I agree with your description that initially, and really for most of its history, the court was neutral, objective. Although I often make a distinction these days between neutrality and objectivity, and maybe we can get into that later.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But the idea was for that court, the Supreme Court, to be, as the cliche goes, the court of last resort, the highest rung on the hierarchy of courts in the federal system, and it's a court that can also accept cases out of state court systems as well. And so it is supposed to be the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate referee for disputes of one kind or another, including especially constitutionally based disputes that surface and that have been appealed through that hierarchy up to the Supreme Court. And so for, as I said, for most of its history, the court lived up to that. I mean, certainly there were periods where critics, especially from one side of the aisle or the other, would be unhappy about what the court was doing. For instance, there were times where the court was accused of being too activist, that rather than being that referee on legal matters, that it was actually establishing the law, that it was making law, and critics jumped on that. Of course, there were defenders of that approach as well, who liked the idea of the court making things right, of looking at a situation, of looking at the nation and what it needed, and in conjunction with what the Constitution allows for or doesn't allow for, of making rulings that would, in some cases, establish new law, of adjusting the law, if you will, of seeing the law and even the Constitution itself as somewhat fluid, in that it can adapt to varying conditions. Some would say that the founders purposefully wrote the Constitution in a somewhat loose, general way so that very thing could happen. And yet we have a group of people, a movement even in some cases, who are opposed to that, who think that the Constitution is carved in granite, and that it's not only its words, but its interpretation should remain unchanged. And that really is a major element of my book, this notion of whether the Constitution is fixed or if it's fluid.
Yes. And in I don't know. I mean, I don't want to talk personal stuff, but is both are they both right? Could they both be right? That were the founders so looking ahead? I guess what I'm trying to think about is, are they looking so far into the future and going, yeah, but what if this, what if that? No, let's just make it general, and then as the time goes on, they can kind of form and mold it to wherever they are in the centuries or whatever. Is that possible?
Oh, absolutely, it's possible, and in fact, there is a school of thought that adopts those sorts of beliefs. These two schools of thought that we're talking about. One is called originalism. Okay, probably fairly self-explanatory that this is a group of people who take that point of view of the Constitution being carved in stone, and that it's inflexible, that it's not adjustable, and that even today it should be interpreted as the founders intended. There are there are significant points of criticism of that approach, however, including how in the world do we know exactly what they intended? The founders. Okay,
right.
There isn't an extensive record whatsoever about that. Some hints here and there, sure, but there's not an extensive record. And in fact, there's just as much of a record to the contrary, that what they intended was that fluid, flexible sort of approach.
Yeah.
So we have the originalists on one side, and then the other approach is commonly referred to as living constitutionalism, that you see the Constitution and its various parts as a living document, that even though its words don't change, aside from the rare amendment, that the law and the interpretation of the Constitution can and arguably should change with the times. That we are not living in the same kind of era in so many ways, technologically, to name just one. As the founders lived, and heck, I mean, even 25 years ago, things were a lot different than they are now. And so some would say that how we see the law, how we see the Constitution should adapt with those times, still, of course, respecting the document and not bucking the system, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but to adapt the wheel, maybe add another spoke or two to the wheel every now and then, or remove a spoke or two.
Right. And you mentioned that you go in depth, or not in depth, or do you in your book about this, or do you touch on it?
Oh, it's a major element of the book. And among the things that I look at, as I said, the focus is primarily, or at least in part, on the current court, at least as it was at the end of the term that ended in June of 2022.
Okay.
And so there is, one of the things I look at is, just as there is a divide, the polarization that I refer to in the subtitle, just as there is a divide in the nation, and I look at that to begin the book, that same kind of divide exists on the Supreme Court. and for many of the same reasons. And so we get currently a 6-3 divide amongst the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, with 6 of them being originalists, and the other 3 being living constitutionalists. And so there is that divide, but when you have what's referred to as a supermajority of 6, then they typically get their way. They're going to outvote the other 3 on a consistent basis, and that especially happens on what we might call the politically charged, politically infused cases that they deal with.
Yeah. Wow. And just that alone, if if the title doesn't get you, what you just said really would drive people to want to find out more about your book, because I think once you get into it, and you can be, is it okay? Look, is it okay to be on the fence with being an originalist or a living what'd you call it, to keep moving? Because I tend to look at today's world and go, maybe that doesn't fit now. Maybe that needs to change a little bit.
I understand that.
But it cannot fit in a political realm. It has to be that balance of power. In my humble estimation, and I only know not much, right? But it seems to me that nobody these days can be in the middle. You either are with something or you're against something. And if you're against something, or if you're with them, then it's all bets are off. We're no longer friends. We're no longer sitting at the same table, no longer holidays together, right? What was your thought okay, first of all, how did you get into writing your book? What gave you the idea?
Sure. If I can, I'll get to that in one second. If I could, please, I just want to respond to what you just said about being in the middle. I agree with you completely. We are clearly in an age of extremes and extremism, and as you say, it's difficult to imagine that someone can be in the middle, as you put it. And I look, I apply that, as we're talking here, and apply that to the Supreme Court, the topic of my book, and that exact same thing has happened there, especially in the supermajority of 6. There is significant extremism there, and we'd like to think that, we talked about how the Supreme Court used to be, even not all that long ago, relatively speaking. And that was an era, we might say, of moderation, okay, where you could have that middle of the road stance, where you're okay with compromise. You're okay with, you give me a little bit here and I'll give you a little bit there. And it arguably produced a much more sane and a much better brand of law that we could that we could follow, that we could agree to, rather than being a catalyst for anger and vitriol, which we see now.
Because it seems like compromise, which is a really good thing, is now seen as a sign of weakness in anything you put it in. It's the sane, rational thing to make compromises about stuff. Not to be a doormat to people, but there are times when you have to do that. But nowadays, it's like, oh, you're a weakling, you're a coward, you don't stand up for what you believe in, when you want to be a rational person. And that's on both sides of the divide. I'm a libertarian, so I think, well, liberal tears and conservative tears both taste awesome.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, just to bring it to what we're talking about here today is we see this on the Supreme Court, and one might think, well, gee, if you're saying this about the Supreme Court, that sounds like it's not so much an institution of justice any longer, it's an institution of politics. Well, guess what? That's exactly my conclusion in this book, that the court has transformed into a political institution. In many ways, it's no different than the institution across the street in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Capitol. It's an institution that is political first and foremost. And really, and not to get away from your previous question too much here, but you can go to the selection process of justices. They're nominated by a politician. Their hearings are conducted in front of politicians. It's a political process replete with political theater. No wonder the Supreme Court has become a political institution.
Yeah.
And so part of what I ultimately in the book recommend is thinking of ways and considering ways that can depoliticize the court to bring it back to an age of more moderation.
What would it take for people, because it seems like the people are no longer in power per se, I think, because politicians, they'll tell you anything they want to get into power, and then once they're there, it's like, oh, I can't, and all these excuses of why they can't do something. Well, I didn't know what it was going to be like when I got into office. I had the greatest of intentions. What can people do to change? Is there anything anybody can do to change the court system, the Supreme Court? Anything?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it's going to be in part the will of the people. We'd like to think, and I'm still, I mean, call me naive, but I'm still an optimist with those sorts of things.
Right.
But the will of the people as conveyed through our congressional representatives. So in part it comes down, therefore, to the power of the vote. We know election after election, the percentage of Americans who actually vote is pathetically low, to be perfectly honest about it. If people have desires, in the political realm, it needs to be conveyed through the vote. And so one of my points is therefore that Congress, both the House and the Senate, can be players in how the court is structured. I mean, certainly the Senate is already a player in whether a nominee is confirmed or not. And so, but in terms of reforms of the court, there has been talk, for example, of term limits. Right now, a Supreme Court justice, once confirmed, is on the court for life.
Why is that? I've always wondered, why is that? Because if I add to it, someone who comes on the court, and like we said, with the Constitution being a living, breathing document, someone who comes on the court in the 70s, they're going to have that certain point of view when it comes to things. And how is that going to work, in the 90s? I'm just giving an example because of that. I mean, of course, we weren't today, but that was just my time frame to give, like the vast differences.
Well, I think the incredible irony is that lifetime appointments were established in an effort to insulate the justices from politics. And for a time, because, for example, they don't have to worry about being reappointed or renominated or reelected in any way.
Okay.
And for that reason, I think that was the basis of the idea, and it was at least moderately successful for a long time. But as I say, the irony now is that those lifetime appointments are actually at the core of the politicization of the Supreme Court. Is why it has become so political, is because the people there now, and again, I feel the need to emphasize, especially in that supermajority of 6, feel insulated from any kind of accountability. Not only in the kinds of decisions they make, in their opinions on the court, not only in things like the decisions of which cases to accept to be heard in the first place, which is a major element that shouldn't be overlooked. Is they have the power to decide which cases they hear and which they don't.
Oh, okay. Actually, I had no idea. I thought everything that went to the Supreme Court went through the Supreme Court, but now figuring probably because hundreds of thousands of cases go to the Supreme Court, then they get to pick and choose. That's interesting.
And not only that, let me add one more element to that. They can, in effect, say, we're not going to hear this case now, but appeal to us again in another year or two, and maybe we'll hear it then. And why would they want to delay it? Because the membership of the court will have changed by then. Okay. And they can get the necessary votes to win, which of course, and therein lies another issue, is why are the justices, before they've even heard a case, before they've even read a brief, why are they already thinking about winning a case and making sure that a case comes out in a particular way? If that doesn't send concern waves through everybody, I'm not sure.
To me, it's
what will.
When you're at this level, it's not like a local lawyer going, I want to win the case. It should be, making the right decision for the country, not like, hey, we're going to win the pennant this year because we made this right choice. To me, I didn't realize the importance of the Supreme Court till this is going to make me such a nerd, a bigger nerd than what I am. In the 90s, when video games were brought before the Supreme Court, and my favorite Supreme Court justice, Justice Scalia, made the case that, video games should be respected as an art form, just as, traditional art, movies, music, and so on. So that's when I was like, you know what? The Supreme Court does kind of do good things once in a while. And I lived in DC at the time, so I was around a lot of that stuff. But
well, and in fact, this hasn't come up yet, but the First Amendment is where my expertise primarily lies, and that, in fact, was a First Amendment case. Video games were seen as a mode of expression, and therefore, Justice Scalia, as you said, was very much on the side of protecting that First Amendment right to those games, even so-called controversial games that contained violence or
if
gore.
You saw Night Trap, the game that caused it, you would laugh yourself to tears. The game is known for being so stupid. And it was a joke in the gaming community, even at the time, that, wait, this is the game that this is the hill the politicians want to die on? Night Trap?
Interesting. So they can literally steer the next generation and generations into their political views, and then once they change something like that, does that become a precedence?
Well, yes, although you probably detected a bit of hesitation in my voice.
Yeah.
It does become a precedent, absolutely. The question then becomes is how ironclad is a precedent? There was a line of thinking that the answer to that question is, pretty darn ironclad. That once something is established in the law, it is set, and that the courts, and especially the United States Supreme Court, ought to respect that.
Mm-hmm.
That said, in the 21-22 term that I focus on in my book, we see examples of the court saying no to precedent, that in spite of the fact of this area of law having been decided, for example, for almost 50 years, we're going to change course because we think now is the time to do that. And in fact, now was also the time where they had the votes on the court to be able to do it. The case that I'm referring to is the Dobbs abortion case.
Yes.
We had a precedent in place for 49 years. And this too, by the way, is an example of the court having previously chosen not to hear a case quite yet, but let's wait a year or two and we'll hear it. And what were they waiting for? They were waiting for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to leave the court, either through retirement or death. Sadly, it was the latter that forced her off the court. And she was replaced with someone, Amy Coney Barrett, whose ideology is far to the right of what Justice Ginsburg's was.
Yeah. Is that one of the reasons, or actually now I'm putting words into your mouth. Were there anything in particular where you decided to write a book now about this time period in our Constitution?
Yeah, thanks for asking that again. I'm glad we got back to that. This project began without this particular end in mind. It first began as an analysis of polarization and tribalization in the country as a whole. Those are some areas where I had done some previous work, some previous writing. And so I was going to expand on that and do a lot of research, a lot of reading, and see where that might take me, what ideas I could come up with that I would want to write about. And the end point also initially was not necessarily a book. In fact, a book was not what I had in mind. I was thinking more in terms of a paper or an article that would appear in an academic journal, which is something that I and people like me do frequently. But as I got into this, number one, I was overwhelmed by the topic of polarization in the country as a whole. It was just too much. I would have to spend the rest of my life working on it, and even then, I'm not sure I would uncover any new ground. And so, as I continue to read and continue to research, I can't remember the exact moment where there was the spark that led me to say, hey, I can take some of these concepts and apply them to the United States Supreme Court. I think what I am reading here, what I am seeing, and some of these specific concepts, and I'll tell you about one of those in a minute because it is central to the book as well. would apply to the Supreme Court. And so I began investigating that. And I concluded that yes, there is a good application here. It not only does it apply, but it helps to it becomes the key that unlocks the door to, I think, some new information, some new ways of seeing the court, of understanding how it works, and the intense and extreme influence that it has on really the lives of every American at one time or another.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
When
Wow.
it comes to me, I'm always, the president, to me, it doesn't really matter that much when you think about it. It does come down to, the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, because, the president can't get anything passed because the guy before him is going to try to stack the deck in favor for the,
Right.
the following term.
Yeah. 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 One question is, so this was based on 2021 to 22, right? How in
That
the
was the
world, how
focus.
long did it take you to write your book? 3 weeks, 4 weeks? That's amazing. But when did you start the paper? And then when did it become a book? Because it sounds like, because you picked last year to do and to start writing what is now your book.
Yes.
And with all the, I can only imagine the legal jargon and the things that you read, how in the world do you put that into something that somebody like me could understand?
Well, so your first question about the length of time it took to put this together, probably from the genesis of the first idea to completion, it was probably a little over a year. And that was a lot of that year, at least a good chunk of it, was working on this full time.
Yeah.
Where I wasn't doing much of anything else, because while I am a college professor, during that time I was on sabbatical leave so that I could work on this.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Right.
So and I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Oh, and so when you started working on it, when did you decide to put it in the book and then it actually coming out? Because I'm sure you have to, in my mind, I'm not a writer. In my mind, it has to be like a story and a timeline, or does it jump to different sections of your book talking about the odds and ends of government? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, of course. The opening of the book, while the Supreme Court is always in focus to one extent or another, the beginning of it is more of a general look at polarization in the country, and some of what, some of the results of that, some of the causes of it, and so forth. And then there is a gradual transformation, I guess we could say, in the book to the Supreme Court specifically. So the book sort of takes the same path that I did in my mind as the project was coming together. I started from general and went to specific, and the book ultimately does that too, with the last I don't know, maybe 2/3 of the book specifically focused on the Supreme Court and what's going on with it. So I mean, I had these ideas. I would pursue them, and as I did, there were some moments of epiphany, frankly, where I was like, "Oh my goodness, I hadn't thought of something in this particular way," but I was able to put a couple of different concepts together and produce this new grain of knowledge, if you will. And so the Supreme Court term was underway. I'm thinking of, we're talking about January, February of 2022. And I knew the cases that they had either already dealt with in oral arguments or were about to, and that would result in opinions later in the year. And usually, as I talked about earlier, these politically charged cases usually the decisions on them are usually released at the very end of the term, mid to late June. And so I basically had everything lined up and ready to go, waiting for those rulings to be issued, and expecting them to come out in a particular way, but of course, wanting to be flexible in case there were some surprises.
Yeah.
Well, there were not any surprises. They came out exactly as I thought they would. All of them 6-3 rulings, the same 6 in the majority, the same 3 that were the dissenters. But what I still had to do was track down the actual official opinions from the court, not just of the court, but even the concurring opinions, the dissenting opinions, and really dissect those and utilize those to help make the kinds of points that I had ultimately wanted to.
Wow.
That's
Now,
a lot of work.
oh, that is a lot of work.
And I'm sure it's a lot of frustrating stuff, like, why are they so childish when you're going over everything?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to agree that yes, there are all of those sorts of elements.
Yeah. And you really have to, I tell you, so obviously you had mentioned that you focus on the First Amendment, which is free speech, correct?
Yes.
And so you really, you have a mind frame and a mindset where I find it fascinating that you thought ahead, and maybe it's just me, because again, I'm not a writer, but you thought ahead of what you needed and what you were waiting for to actually wrap up your book in a way where it sounds like a very well-rounded book. I tell you. What are some of your I know, in our communication back and forth, but we kind of like, do you have your book in front of you by chance?
I do.
Would you like to read like a little excerpt? And I'm sorry just throwing this on you to surprise, but we like to hear a little bit of whatever our guest has of it, like music, and in your case, an excerpt from your book. I find it very fascinating that people are so creative in different ways, right? I find it really, really fascinating. Gosh, Joseph, you're pretty amazing.
Well,
Here.
thank you very much. Yeah, if you want me to read, I certainly can. It's a bit of a challenge to pick out a little passage here, but I've come up with one. I haven't committed it to memory. You'll have to forgive me. So
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what lies ahead, but I'm glad to share it with you.
Perfect.
This is near the very end of the book. It's not the end, but it's near the end. So I write, as suggested, the solution to the problems I've been outlining is straightforward, though not easily accomplished: depoliticization. When politics is not only allowed, but also encouraged, the court becomes not merely a political institution, but one that loses its way, straying from its purpose. Under a regime of politics, worldview and constitutional approach are magnified, with their various traits forced to the surface. Faustian bargains are made with politicians in robes, who, from their nominations onward, are expected to bring about specific results, and in some cases are happy to fulfill those expectations. The Supreme Court may retain the moniker of court of last resort, but for growing numbers of people, that signifies despair, not hope. The story of the 20th century American constitutional law was one of bringing people who were previously excluded into the fold. It was always known that the movement had its dissidents. Now it seems that while still a majority of American society, they are a majority on the nation's highest court.
Wow. And that really sums up what we've been talking about, and obviously sums up your book. But gosh, Joseph, you're absolutely amazing. Before we wrap up, what is this, your first book?
No, I've this is my sixth, actually.
Oh,
Sixth.
wow.
Okay.
What were the others on?
Yeah.
I beg your pardon?
What were the other books on?
They are all on law, First Amendment issues, a field called mass communication law. That's a course, for example, that I teach in my university professor role. So things of that nature.
Oh,
Okay.
oh gosh.
All
Now
sound very
mass
interesting.
communication. Yeah, very interesting. Sorry for cutting you off, Eric, but I have to ask, mass communication law, that's entertainment law.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know. Should we try to take a chance and ask about strike stuff? The what's going on? And I'm not putting you in any kind of position. If you would, well,
You
okay,
could hold
what's
that
the
for the sequel.
right. If you would like to, what is the order in the court? Do not ask that question. Order in the
You're in contempt right now, Larry.
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah. I may have to invoke that.
Okay. And you know, honestly, Eric and I aren't lawyers, but sitting on the outside looking in, and I was a part of SAG, and sitting on the outside looking in, I agree with both sides. I get it. As a business owner, you have a bottom line and you have to make this bottom line. As an actor, as a performer, you have to have a bottom line. And if the owner isn't able to pay, it's amazing. It's a mess. I do believe AI is probably one of the ruinations of the world if it continues to go
James
that way.
Cameron told us about this 30 years ago, people.
Right.
Isaac Asimov told us about it 50 years ago. More than 50 years ago.
And who's that, Sir Isaac Newton? Didn't he
No,
warn about
Isaac
AI?
Asimov, he
No, I
wrote,
know.
his books are all about the 5 laws of robotics. Man, am I coming out as a giant nerd, more than what I am on this show.
Well, Joe,
Well, you guys have me at an extreme disadvantage here. Not in nerdness. I don't mean to say that, but I have to say what you're getting into is more of labor law, and that's where I among the many areas where I have no expertise.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Perfect. Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, Joseph, again, we really want to thank you for coming on the show. Links will be in the description of where you could purchase it. And hey, everybody listening, if me and Larry could understand it, anyone could understand this.
Exactly.
So please definitely look into it. And I know, like a lot of you, myself included, you are just burnt out and bitter towards politics, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be interested, because hey, if something like video games could be before there, then could be taken away from you, anything has the chance of being taken away from you. So register the vote. And I know usually when people talk about that, they mean vote for my person. I could care less who you vote for. Just make sure you register and are active politically, because then you can't complain.
Right. Right.
And as we again, Joseph, thank you. And the main reason why you should vote, everybody, is because of what I always close our show with. Support our troops. There are 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds dying, so you can make a choice. Have a great week, everybody.